This happened during my junior year of high school, back in 2019. I attended Northwood High, a big old building that was all brick and creaky floors, built back in the 1950s. It was the kind of school that felt completely different after the final bell rang. Empty, echoey, and a lot bigger than it seemed during the day. I was on the yearbook committee, and we were down to the wire on deadlines. Our advisor, Mr. Davies, had given a few of us keys to the media lab so we could put in extra hours after school to finish the layout. Most nights, a group of 4 or 5 of us would stay until maybe 6 or 7. But this one Tuesday in October, it ended up just being me. My partner, Jake, had called in sick, and the others had band practice or family stuff. I figured I'd just put in a couple of quiet hours and get a huge chunk of work done. I told the janitor, Mr. Henderson, I was staying. He just nodded and said he'd be waxing the floors in the West Wing and to swing by and let him know when I was leaving. I should have just gone home. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. The media lab was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. I had my music playing through my earbuds, clicking and dragging photos into place. The sun went down, and the motion-activated lights in the hallway outside would occasionally click off, leaving me in a little pool of light from the lab. I just clap my hands or step into the hallway to get them to flicker back on. It was a little spooky, but normal spooky. The kind of thing you laugh about. The first thing that felt off was the smell. I caught a whiff of something really strong and sweet, like cheap men's cologne. It was the kind of stuff my dad wore in the 90s. It was so out of place in a school. I took my earbuds out and looked around. The hallway was empty. The smell faded after a minute, and I wrote it off as maybe a cleaner they'd used in one of the rooms. I went back to work. About 15 minutes later, I heard a door shut. Not a slam, just a solid thud of a heavy classroom door closing. It sounded like it came from down the hall, toward the main staircase. The lights in that section of the hall were off. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Henderson?" No answer. Just silence. My heart started beating a little faster. It was probably just the janitor, I told myself. But why would he be up here? He said he was in the West Wing. This was the East. I got up and closed the media lab door, clicking the lock shut. It made me feel a little better. I tried to focus on my work, but I was now hyper aware of every little sound. The hum of my computer, the buzz of the fluorescent light above me, the old building settling. Then I heard something new, a faint scraping sound. It was slow and deliberate, like something was being dragged along the lockers out in the hall. It would go for a few seconds, stop, then start again a little closer. I sat frozen at the computer, my cursor hovering over an image of the football team. The scraping stopped right outside the lab door. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the thin strip of light under the door, waiting to see a shadow move. Nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a new sound, a low, soft whistling. It was a tune I didn't recognize, something old-fashioned and off-key. It was right there, just on the other side of the door. The doorknob jiggled. Just once, gently, like someone was testing it. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. No service, of course. The school was a dead zone, especially in the older rooms. The whistling stopped. Then I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, low and raspy, like he had a sore throat. He wasn't talking to me. He was muttering to himself, just loud enough for me to hear through the door. "Not this one. No, later." Then I heard the scraping sound again, moving away down the hall. The motion-activated lights flicked on, one by one, tracking his movement away from me. I waited, pressed against the wall for 5 full minutes. Silence. I had to get out. I had to find Mr. Henderson. I slowly, quietly unlocked the door and peeked out. The hallway was empty. I grabbed my backpack, left all my stuff on the desk, and slipped out, moving as quietly as I could toward the staircase. The lights began to click off behind me, plunging the hall I just left into darkness. I made it to the top of the main stairs. The sweet cologne smell was here too, stronger than before. I started descending, my hand on the cold metal railing. I was halfway down when I saw him. A man was standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark old-fashioned suit that looked like it was from another decade. His face was pale and seemed oddly stretched. But the worst part was his expression. He was smiling, a wide, toothy smile that didn't reach his eyes. They were just dark. He held one hand behind his back. We just stared at each other. I was frozen on the staircase. He took one step up, then another. His shoes were perfectly quiet on the linoleum steps. That's when I noticed his other hand, the one behind his back, was holding a long, heavy-looking monkey wrench. The metal head scraped against the wall as he moved. I turned and bolted back up the stairs, not caring about the noise. I heard his footsteps quicken behind me, still eerily quiet, but the scraping of the wrench against the wall was frantic now. I didn't run back to the media lab. I cut down a different hallway, toward the west wing, praying I'd find Mr. Henderson. I could hear him behind me, the whistling starting again, that same off-key tune, right on my heels. I burst through the double doors into the west wing and almost cried with relief. Mr. Henderson was there, pushing his waxing machine in slow, steady lines. "Mr. Henderson?" I screamed, running toward him. He jumped, turning off the machine. "Chloe, what in the world? I thought you'd left. There's a man," I gasped, pointing back toward the doors. "A man with a wrench. He was following me." Mr. Henderson's face went serious. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his cart. "Stay right here." He walked to the double doors and pushed them open, shining the light down the dark hallway I'd just come from. He stood there for a long time, looking. He came back, his expression confused. "There's no one there, kid. Are you sure? Maybe you've been working too hard." "I'm sure. I saw him. He was at the bottom of the stairs." He humored me. We walked the entire second floor together. Every classroom was locked. Every hallway was empty. The front doors of the school were still locked from the inside. We even checked the media lab. My computer was still on, my stuff untouched. There was no sign anyone else had been there. Mr. Brock Henderson gave me a kind, pitying look. "Your eyes play tricks on you in this old place when it's empty. Let's get you home." I never went back after dark again. I told my parents I was just stressed from schoolwork. I didn't tell any of my friends. It was easier to just try and forget it. The following spring, I was in the library doing research for a history paper on the town. I was looking through old yearbooks for pictures. I pulled out a volume from 1963, the Northwood High yearbook, The Oak. I was flipping through it idly, looking at the hairstyles and the clothes, and then I saw him. My blood went cold. There he was. His name was listed as Arthur Phelps, custodial staff. He was tall and thin, with that same pale, stretched face. He wasn't smiling in the picture. He was just staring blankly at the camera. The caption below his name mentioned he had been a dedicated employee for over a decade before his sudden passing in the winter of 1962. The cause of death wasn't listed. I slowly closed the book and pushed it away. I thought about the muttering I'd heard through the door. Not this one. No, later. I thought about the wrench, a tool a custodian might carry. I thought about the smell of old cologne. I never found out why he was there that night. I never found out what he was looking for, or who he thought I was. I just know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm walking down a quiet hallway, I catch a faint, sweet smell in the air, and I have to stop myself from running. This happened during my senior year at Northgate High, a sprawling 3-story brick building that felt more like a maze than a school. It was April, and I was deep in the grind of college applications and AP exam prep. I was the editor for the school newspaper, the Northgate Chronicle, and we were putting together a massive end-of-year issue. Most of the staff had left by 5, but I'd volunteered to stay late to finish editing the layout. I figured I'd be there until 7, maybe 7:30. I'd done it before. The school was usually quiet, just me and the head custodian, Mr. Gable, who did his rounds around 8 before setting the alarms. I told him I was in room 214, the journalism lab, and he gave me his usual gruff nod and told me to make sure the door locked behind me when I left. The first couple of hours were perfectly normal. The journalism lab was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. I had the room to myself, the only sounds being the hum of the old iMacs and the occasional rustle of papers. As the sun set, the long corridor outside grew dark, the motion sensor lights only flicking on in sections as I moved around the room. I'd get up to get a drink from the water fountain down the hall, and the lights would pop on ahead of me, then click off behind me, leaving a trail of darkness. It was a little eerie, but in a familiar way. I was used to it. The first thing that felt off was the intercom. At exactly 6:17 p.m., the little gray speaker box mounted above the door crackled to life. It wasn't the piercing emergency alert tone, just the soft hiss of an open line. Then a voice came through, but it was distorted, like someone was talking through a mouthful of water. It was low, a whisper that was somehow amplified across the entire room. It said, "Section C is clear." Then it cut out. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. That was something the custodian said sometimes when they finished a part of the building. But the voice, it was all wrong. It was too soft, too garbled. I shook it off. A bad connection. Mr. Gable must have been testing his radio or something. I tried to refocus on my work, but the silence felt heavier now. About 20 minutes later, I heard the distant sound of a door closing. Not a slam, but a solid, heavy thunk, like the fire door at the far end of the wing. I listened, straining my ears. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from the math wing, one hallway over. Then another door closed, even closer. It was a pattern. It was methodical, like someone was checking every single classroom, moving down the hallway toward the journalism lab. My heart started to beat a little faster. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and thin in the empty room. "Mr. Gable?" The door closing stopped. The only answer was the sudden, deafening buzz of the fluorescent light directly above my head. It flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging half the room into shadow. I let out a little gasp and scrambled to turn on the desk lamp. Its weak, yellow light created a small pool of safety around my desk. That's when I heard the whistling. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere downstairs, a tuneless, wandering melody. It was an old song, something my grandfather might have whistled. It was completely out of place. I stood up and slowly crept to the door, peering out the small wire-reinforced window. The hallway was dark. All the motion sensor lights had timed out. The whistling grew louder. It was coming up the staircase at the end of the hall. I could hear slow, shuffling footsteps accompanying it. Not the brisk, sure steps of Mr. Gable in his work boots. These were slower, heavier. I ducked away from the window, my back against the wall, my breath catching in my throat. The whistling and the shuffling reached the top of the stairs and started coming down the hall toward the lab. I could see the motion sensor lights at that end of the hall blink on, one after another, tracking the approach of whoever or whatever was coming. The light outside room 214 flicked on, illuminating the hallway right outside my door. The whistling stopped right there. I didn't dare look. I held my breath. I heard a soft, scraping sound against the door, like a fingernail slowly dragging down the wood. Then a low, raspy voice spoke, so close it sounded like it was right in my ear. "Are you lost?" It whispered. I clapped my hand over my mouth to stop from screaming. I fumbled for my phone on the desk. No service. Of course. The school was a dead zone. The doorknob began to jiggle. Ever so slightly. Then it stopped. The motion sensor light outside my door clicked off. I waited, trembling, pressed against the wall for what felt like an eternity. Silence. I had to get out. I couldn't stay locked in there. I had to make a run for the main staircase. I slowly, quietly, unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack. The hallway was pitch black and utterly silent. I slipped out, my every footstep sounding like a thunderclap on the linoleum. The lights didn't come on. I felt my way along the lockers, heading for the stairwell. I was almost there when my hand brushed against something wet and sticky on one of the locker doors. I jerked my hand back, stifling a cry. I couldn't see what it was. I pushed through the stairwell door and half ran, half fell down the steps to the first floor. The main lobby was dark, the emergency exit signs providing the only ghastly green light. The front doors were locked with a heavy chain. I was trapped. I needed to find Mr. Gable's office or a landline phone, anything. I turned toward the administrative offices, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing at the other end of the lobby, near the principal's office. He was just a silhouette against the green glow, tall and impossibly thin. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing me. And I realized the whistling had started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from around me. It was coming from him. The tune was the same, but now it was low and distorted, like it was playing from a broken recorder inside his chest. I backed away, toward the library. He took a step forward. His movement was all wrong. It wasn't a step so much as a lurch, a sudden jerk forward without any of the mechanics of walking. I turned and ran into the library, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I hid behind a bookshelf, trying to control my ragged breathing. I heard the shuffling steps stop outside the library door. The doorknob turned. Then, nothing. After several minutes of silence, I dared to peek. The lobby was empty. I saw a light on in Mr. Gable's custodial office, a small room off the main hallway. Relief flooded through me. I unlocked the library door and sprinted for it, bursting inside. "Mr. Gable, there's someone in here. The office was empty. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the desk next to a cold cup of coffee. The radio on his desk crackled. And then that same distorted, watery voice from the intercom spilled out of it. "Room 214. The layout isn't finished." He knew what I was working on. He knew what room I was in. I didn't wait another second. I ran to the back of the school, to the gymnasium entrance, knowing it had push-bar fire doors that would set off an alarm. I didn't care. I slammed into the bar, the ear-splitting shriek of the alarm filling the night. I ran across the football field and didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, where I finally got a signal and called my dad. The police came. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. Mr. Gable was found safe, having been in the boiler room in the basement the entire time. His radio off while he worked on a faulty valve. He said he never made any announcements, and his radio had been dead for a week. I told my parents it was just a panic attack brought on by stress. I quit the newspaper. I never stayed late again. A year later, after I'd graduated, I was talking to a friend who was on the yearbook committee. She mentioned they'd found a bunch of old photos from the 1970s in a storage closet. One of them was a class picture of the newspaper staff from 1974 standing in front of room 214. The teacher supervising them was a tall, thin man named Mr. Albright. She said he was a stickler for deadlines, famous for prowling the halls after hours to check on students who were behind. He had a heart attack and died right there in the school library in 1978. She laughed and said, "Guess some people never really clock out." She thought it was a funny story. I didn't laugh. I just remembered the raspy whisper outside the door, the wet touch on the locker, the distorted voice on the radio knowing exactly what I was doing. I never found out what he meant by Section C is clear, but sometimes, when I'm working late alone in my dorm, I'll hear the faint sound of whistling from the hallway, and I have to check the lock on my door 3 times before I can breathe again. This happened during my final year at Brookhaven High, a massive, aging building that always seemed to be groaning under its own weight. It was the week before midterms in my senior year, and I was drowning in textbooks. My house was pure chaos. My younger brothers were loud, and my parents were renovating the kitchen. The only place I could find any real quiet was the school library, which stayed open until 9 on weeknights for studying. I'd made a habit of it, usually staying from around 5 until closing. I knew the head librarian, Mrs. Gable, and the nighttime janitor, a quiet guy named Ray who just nodded as he emptied the trash cans. This particular Tuesday started like any other. I found my usual spot in the far back corner of the library, a carrel tucked between the history section and a fire exit. The place was pretty empty, just a few other students scattered around, all of us buried in our work. Around 7, the overhead fluorescents in the main part of the library clicked off, leaving just the dim study lamps at each carrel on. Mrs. Gable made her rounds, telling us she was heading out and that Ray was in the building if we needed anything. The other kids trickled out soon after, and by 7:30, it was just me. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional turn of a page. The first thing that felt off was the smell. It was a sharp, acrid smell, like ammonia or really strong glass cleaner. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I figured Ray must be mopping the hallway right outside the library doors. I went back to my biology notes, trying to ignore it. After a few minutes, the smell faded away. I remember feeling relieved, thinking the ventilation system had finally kicked in and cleared it out. About 15 minutes later, I heard the squeak of wheels. It was the distinct, high-pitched squeal of the book cart the librarians used to reshelve returns. It was coming from a few aisles over in the fiction section. I smiled a little, thinking Mrs. Gable must have decided to stay late after all, or that Ray was doing some tidying up. The squeaking stopped, and I heard the soft, methodical thump of books being placed on shelves. It was weirdly rhythmic, almost too perfect. But it was a comforting sound. It meant I wasn't alone. I got up to stretch my legs and maybe ask if she wanted me to lock up when I left. I walked into the fiction aisle, but it was empty. The lights in that section were off. The cart was gone. "Hello?" I called out. My voice was swallowed by the tall shelves. No answer. I shrugged, assuming the sound had just carried from another part of the library. I went to the bathroom, which was just outside the library doors in the main hall. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs. Ray's cleaning cart was parked by the water fountain, supplies neatly arranged. It looked like he was taking a break. When I returned to my Carol, my heart skipped a beat. My biology textbook was closed. I had definitely left it open to the chapter on cellular respiration. My pen was also gone from where I'd left it on top of my notes. I felt a prickle of annoyance. Maybe Mrs. Gable had come by and closed it, thinking I'd left. But that wasn't like her. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. My pen was lying neatly in the center of the Carol next to mine, the one that had been empty all night. I grabbed my pen, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. That's when the squeaking started again. This time, it was closer, much closer. It was coming from the very next aisle over. I could hear that same rhythmic thump of books being shelved. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The squeaking moved down the aisle, then stopped right at the end of my row. I could see the shadow of the cart cast on the floor by my dim lamp. Then a voice. It was a dry, whispery sound, like pages rustling together. "You're in my spot." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, but the aisle behind me was empty. The voice hadn't come from behind me, though. It had come from everywhere, from right beside my ear. The motion-activated lights at the front of the library suddenly flicked on. Nobody was there. They clicked off a moment later. I started shoving my books into my backpack, my hands shaking. I had to get out. The squeaking started again, moving quickly now, heading toward the library's main entrance. I heard the double doors swing open and then sigh shut. Whoever it was gone. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and hurried toward the doors, eager to get out and find Ray. The doors were locked. I jiggled the handle, pushing against the metal bar. It didn't budge. They were supposed to be unlocked from the inside. Panic began to rise in my throat. I was locked in. I pulled out my phone. No service, of course. I turned to go back to the librarian's desk to use the landline phone, but I stopped dead. All the study lamps at the Carols had been turned off. The entire library was pitch black, except for a single, dim light still on at the very back. At my Carol, and sitting in the chair of the Carol next to mine, the one that had been empty, was a dark, shapeless figure. It was just a silhouette against the weak light, but I could see it was sitting perfectly still, facing my desk, as if it was waiting for me to come back and finish studying. I backed away from the doors, my breath coming in short gasps. My only way out was the fire exit right next to my study spot, right next to it. I had to go back. I had to run past it. I moved as quietly as I could, sticking to the edges of the room, my back against the shelves. The darkness was so complete, I had to feel my way along. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. I was about halfway there when the squeaking started again. It wasn't coming from the front of the library. It was coming from the darkness ahead of me. The book cart was moving toward me, squeaking relentlessly, and I could see a tall, thin figure pushing it, its form blotting out the little light from the exit sign behind it. It was hurting me. I turned to run back toward the main doors, but I tripped over a chair leg and crashed to the floor, my backpack skidding away from me. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees as the squeaking grew louder, more frantic. The cart was coming right at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the impact. It never came. The squeaking stopped. The smell of ammonia was so overpowering it made me gag. I opened my eyes. The cart was parked perfectly beside me, its wheels neatly aligned with the tiles. It was filled with books, and sitting on top of the pile was my backpack, zipped up neatly. The figure was gone. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, lunged for the fire exit door, and slammed into the push bar. The alarm screamed into the night, but I didn't care. I ran across the parking lot and didn't stop until I was safe in my car, locking all the doors. The school security guard found me 10 minutes later. He said he'd been doing his rounds and heard the alarm. I told him I'd gotten locked in. He was confused. He said the library doors are never locked from the inside during study hours. He checked them himself. They were unlocked. He asked me if I'd seen Ray, the janitor. I said no. The guard just shook his head. That's odd. He radioed in sick tonight, hasn't been here all evening. I never studied in the library again. I told my parents I found the silence distracting. A few months later, at graduation, I was talking to an old history teacher. I mentioned the library, and he told me a story about the woman who'd run it for 30 years before Mrs. Gable. A real stickler for silence and order. She'd had a system for everything, especially her book cart. She died of a stroke one night after closing up, right there in the stacks. They found her the next morning. He said her name was Miss Weber, and she was famous for two things: her intense love of quiet and the powerful, strange-smelling polish she used on the library's wood shelves that nobody else was ever allowed to touch. He laughed it off as an old-school legend. I didn't laugh. I just remembered the whisper, the squeaking wheels, and the overwhelming smell of chemical polish. I think she just wanted everything back in its proper place. And that night, I was something out of place. Sometimes, when it's too quiet, I can still hear the faint squeak of wheels, and I have to turn on all the lights just to feel safe. She's still tidying up, and she doesn't like it when people stay past closing.